13 days before Christmas 2025, the President of the United States announced in a social media post that NVIDIA could sell its most powerful AI chip to China. Footnote 1. A month later, the Commerce Department made it official, with conditions attached that experts immediately called contradictory. Footnote 2. A day after that, the same administration imposed a 25% tariff on those exact same chips, under a national security order that had been 9 months in the making. Footnote 3. 6 months before any of that, the same chip line had been banned outright on national security grounds, then quietly unbanned 3 months later, with a cut of the revenue going straight to the U.S. Treasury as the price of admission. Footnote 4. If you're having trouble following that, you're not alone. And that's before this July when the Financial Times reported that Beijing is now drafting its own export controls, on its own AI models, on its own chip designs, specifically to stop its own technology from leaking to the West. Footnote 5. The people writing the world's chip policy do not appear to know from one quarter to the next whether they're building a wall or opening a gate. There's a word for a policy that reverses direction this fast. It isn't strategy. It's whiplash. And whiplash turns out to be exactly what happens when you try to weaponize the one industry too complicated for anyone to actually control. Here's what an export control on a computer chip actually is, mechanically, because ban is doing a lot of work it doesn't deserve. The U.S. system runs through the Commerce Department's Bureau of Industry and Security, which maintains something called the Entity List, a roster of specific foreign companies that U.S. firms need a special license to sell to, with that license presumed denied rather than presumed approved. Since 2022, BIS has also drawn lines around chip performance itself, specifically computing power and chip-to-chip interconnect bandwidth, so that a chip can be restricted for what it can technically do, not just for who's buying it. That October 2022 rule was the real opening shot. It restricted the sale of advanced AI training chips and the equipment used to make them, and required U.S. citizens working at Chinese fabs to get a personal license just to keep doing their jobs. Footnote 6. Round 2 came in October 2023, closing a loophole where NVIDIA had built slightly downgraded chips, the A800 and H800, specifically to sit just under the original performance line. Footnote 7. NVIDIA's answer to that was the H20, a chip engineered deliberately and successfully to be legal. Footnote 8. It complied with every rule on the books. And then, in April 2025, the new administration banned it anyway, on national security grounds, arguing the rules themselves hadn't kept pace with what the chip could actually do. Footnote 9. 3 months later, in July 2025, the same administration quietly reversed itself and let H20 shipments resume, alongside AMD's competing MI308 chip, with a 15% cut of the resulting revenue routed to the federal government as a condition of approval. Footnotes 9 and 10. Then came the H200. In December 2025, the president announced on social media that NVIDIA could sell it to China too, floating a 25% revenue share and a rough cap of 75,000 chips per approved customer. Footnotes 1 and 11. Commerce codified the rule on January 13, 2026, restricting approval to roughly 10 vetted Chinese firms, Alibaba, Tencent, and ByteDance among them. The very next day, the same administration layered on a Section 232 national security tariff, 25%, on the same chips, via a process that had been quietly running for 9 months already. Footnotes 2 and 3. Worth flagging honestly because the reporting doesn't agree cleanly here. Some coverage describes that 25% as the revenue share condition itself. Other coverage describes it as a separate, additional tariff stacked on top of a different fee. Untangling which precisely would need clearer documentation directly from Commerce than currently exists in public reporting. So both figures are presented here as they appear, rather than blended into one. And even with all of that sorted out on paper, actual chip deliveries under the H200 approval reportedly still hadn't happened as of mid-2026, stuck in a kind of bureaucratic limbo, partly because Beijing has been discouraging its own tech firms from buying foreign chips at all, a thread Section 2 picks up directly. Footnote 12. That's the mechanism. A performance threshold, an entity list, a licensing regime, and, layered on top of all three in the space of about 14 months, a ban and unban, a revenue cut, an announcement, a rule, and a tariff. 4 policy reversals on one chip family in just over a year isn't a system working as intended. It's a system arguing with itself in public. Here's the part the domestic chip policy story usually skips. The United States doesn't actually own the choke point it's been fighting over. The Netherlands does. SML, headquartered outside Eindhoven, is the sole manufacturer on Earth of the extreme ultraviolet lithography machines needed to etch the smallest chip features. Machines so specialized that a single unit takes months to assemble and ship. Since 2019, the US and Dutch governments have coordinated, later joined by Japan, to keep that specific technology out of China, arguably the single most consequential restriction in the entire fight. Footnotes 13 and 14. But Dutch export policy has a structural difference from the American version that matters enormously. It's country-neutral, assessed case by case, rather than presumption of denial by default. As of this year, roughly 41 Chinese companies hold valid licenses to import ASML's older deep ultraviolet, DUV, machines, the tier just below EUV. Footnote 15. And reporting has documented Chinese manufacturers upgrading older, already licensed ASML DUV tools to squeeze out 7nm class chips. Not the cutting edge but good enough to matter and entirely outside the EUV restrictions reach. Footnote 16. The Netherlands has tightened its own rules twice since. Most recently this June, moving to stop ASML from even servicing and maintaining lithography systems Chinese customers already own, aligning further with Washington's posture. Footnote 17. But already aligning further is itself the tell. Alignment has been a multi-year, incremental catch-up process, not a single coordinated policy from day one. Meanwhile, Japan's Tokyo Electron makes chip-making tools that are functionally comparable to some controlled American equipment. And because Tokyo Electron isn't bound by the same restrictions, its China sales have reportedly risen since US controls took effect. Footnote 18. That's the worst version of a coordination gap. American firms absorb the lost revenue from a policy that doesn't actually stop the underlying technology from reaching its target, because a close ally's equivalent product fills the exact space the restriction opened up. A U.S. congressional committee raised exactly this concern this year, accusing ASML, Tokyo Electron, and several American toolmakers alike of continuing to profit from sales to Chinese state-linked buyers regardless of where they're headquartered. Footnote 19. Zoom out and the comparative picture isn't the US versus China. It's 3 or 4 governments, Washington, The Hague, Tokyo, and increasingly Seoul over memory chips, trying to run the same policy through separate legal systems, separate industries, and separate domestic politics, with the actual choke point technology sitting inside a Dutch company answerable to Dutch law first. Every door has a locked room behind it. Here's this one's shape, and it's a genuinely new one. Tighten the controls and you get exactly the outcome you were trying to prevent. Loosen them and you get exactly the other outcome you were trying to prevent. There's no setting on the dial that avoids both. Watch what's actually happened on the tighten side. Denied access to NVIDIA's top-tier chips for years running, China's domestic industry didn't stall out. It got a mandate. SMIC, the country's leading foundry, is now running high-volume production on a 5nm class node using older deep ultraviolet lithography and aggressive multi-patterning, a technique widely assumed to be commercially unworkable at that density without EUV, until SMIC did it anyway. Footnote 20. Huawei's Ascend 950 series AI accelerators, released this year, include in-house high-bandwidth memory for the first time, engineered specifically to route around the export-controlled memory suppliers, Samsung and SK Hynix, that Ascend chips used to depend on. Footnote 18. China's own 5-year plan, running through 2030, now names 7 and 5nm logic production and domestic memory capacity as explicit state targets, not aspirations, line items. Footnote 20. None of this is functional parity with NVIDIA's frontier chips. Huawei's own yield rates on its flagship Ascend 910C reportedly run as low as 20 to 40%. And its chips still trail NVIDIA's best by a wide and growing memory bandwidth gap. But not caught up, and not accelerating, are different claims, and the honest read of 2025 and 2026 is acceleration, driven in large part by the very controls meant to prevent it. Now watch the loosened side, the H20 and H200 reversals covered in Section 1. Easing restrictions to keep Chinese firms buying American chips instead of investing harder in domestic alternatives is a coherent strategic argument on its own terms. It's also the argument a bipartisan group in Congress has directly challenged, warning that even a restricted, revenue-taxed, licensed version of frontier compute still hands a strategic rival exactly the hardware it would otherwise have to build for itself, on a slower timeline at higher cost. Tightening accelerates indigenization. Loosening hands over the thing indigenization was supposed to make unnecessary. This is the boomerang, a policy tool that comes back around and hits whoever threw it regardless of which direction they threw it in. It isn't a room hiding an incumbent, a hostage, a bargain, a relocated perimeter, a chain letter, a load-bearing wall, or a locksmith's monopoly. It's a door that opens onto whichever of two bad rooms you didn't choose. Strip away the licensing schedules and the tariff percentages, and one physical fact sits underneath the entire fight, mostly unaddressed by anything in sections 1 through 3, the actual frontier of chip manufacturing, the nodes beyond what SMIC's DUV workarounds can reach, still runs almost entirely through one company, on one island 90 miles off the Chinese coast. TSMC's most advanced fabrication remains concentrated in Taiwan, and every hedge against that concentration, the CHIPS Act-funded TSMC facility under construction in Arizona chief among them, remains years from matching Taiwan's leading-edge capacity, let alone replacing it. Whatever direction the export control fight goes next, it's being fought over a choke point that itself sits inside the single most geopolitically exposed piece of real estate discussed anywhere on this show. That exposure cuts against easy villains on either side. Washington's controls exist in part because losing Taiwan's fabrication capacity to conflict or coercion would be catastrophic regardless of what China's own chip industry can do by then. Beijing's push for domestic self-sufficiency exists in part because depending indefinitely on a choke point it doesn't control, and that its own rhetoric treats as sovereign territory, is not a position any government would accept if it had another option. And the fight is already spilling past chips into the raw material fight this show covered directly last episode. China's rare earth and critical mineral leverage, the licensing regime that's already reshaped magnet and gallium supply chains, sits one negotiating table over from the chip fight, and Chinese officials have made no secret that the two are linked in practice even when discussed separately in public. Now agilize development directly. Beijing weighing its own export controls on AI models, training data, and chip designs, aimed specifically at preventing its own frontier technology from reaching Western firms. Footnote 5. The country that has spent 3 years as the subject of this show's export control coverage is actively drafting the mirror version of the same tool. Whether that becomes its own case study or simply another turn of Section 3's boomerang is, as of this session, genuinely still being written, in trade negotiations, licensing schedules, and a 5-year plan, rather than in anything resembling a settled outcome. 2 governments, at least 4 allied jurisdictions, and 1 company on one island are currently running the most consequential industrial policy experiment of the decade, and not one of them has managed to hold a stable position on it for longer than about 6 months. That instability isn't a bug in the reporting. It's the actual state of the policy. The next time someone tells you confidently how this ends, ask them which version of this year's rules they're using, because there's a good chance it already changed twice since they checked. Tariffs, it turns out, aren't just a chip fight footnote anymore. They're becoming the default tool everywhere trade policy touches this show, which is exactly where we're headed next.